Hello, hello. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Inner RAE podcast. I am Erin and I will be your host for today. Katie is on vacation, so she'll be joining us as soon as she gets back. And today I am super pumped because I've invited a dear friend of mine and an amazing human to be interviewed on the podcast. And her name is Sarah Saturday. She is a multimedia performing artist, and she is also a software developer by day. We will be talking about that a little bit because today we are going to be talking about the way in which relational dynamics show up in the workplace and in our work. So, without further ado, hi, Sarah. Welcome to the Inner RAE podcast.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, so excited. I like to start these episodes by connecting our audience with how we know each other. This is a really wonderful story. I'll try not to go too far down memory lane with it. Sarah and I met for the very first time at a 12-step meeting, specifically Al-Anon. And I know for both of us, that's a huge part of our recovery and healing journey. I remember seeing her in the back of Bluebird Cafe and just something about her, something she shared, maybe the energy, whatever. I walked right up to her and I was like, oh my gosh, we have to be friends. And well, here we are, what, 12, 13?
Yeah, I think it's 11, going on 11 or 12. Yeah.
Okay, well, I like to be hyperbolic. 11, 12 years later, we're still friends. And actually, side note, you had a podcast a while ago, and I think I was one of your first guests. So it feels like this is very full circle for many reasons. But the other reason I brought Sarah onto the podcast today, not only is she a brilliant artist and a talented software developer, but Sarah is by far, and anybody that knows her would agree with me, she's by far one of the most committed recovering people I've ever met. And one of the ways that I've always really admired and used her as a fellow traveler, collaborated with her on my own recovery, has been specifically around this topic of workplace dysfunction, because for me, that is a huge place that so many of my patterns played out, and it's not always talked about. So with that, I would love to start by asking you, Sarah, at what point in your journey did you realize you were going to have to examine how your relational dynamics, how the way that you were raised and the dysfunction that you experienced, when did you realize you were going to have to examine your relationships at work or your relationship to work?
Excellent question. And yes, this is something that never gets talked about. Rarely. It comes up in meetings sometimes, and people are like, light bulb, light bulb, light bulb. But usually we're always talking about roommates, friends, romantic relationships. But man, I mean, since leaving home, the workplace or any kind of situation where I'm working with other people collaboratively is the most like being in a family, a dysfunctional family, of anything else, really. I was probably 2 years into recovery and therapy, serious therapy, when I realized, I'm repeating these patterns in not only the jobs I pick, the types of bosses I am drawn to, the environments that I'm immediately sort of get manic, excited about, and then quickly dissolve into chaos and dysfunction. And I did that like 3 or 4 times in the first couple of years. Because when I first came in, I was, I had never held a job for more than a year. I was just learning how to be a grown-up and how to have a job. And I went through about 2 or 3 really dysfunctional job situations before I kind of hit another little bottom and had to start working the steps and working my recovery and just all of my resources and tools around that.
Yeah, I know for me, I feel like maybe it was happening around the same time. The first time it really occurred to me was when I was deciding to leave my PhD program. And it became so clear to me that there was this maternal and paternal energy at play within the authority figures of the system that I was in. And that, you know, everything inside of me was responding with the same kind of emotional patterning that I had responded to things as a child. And even though at the time when I decided to quit my doctorate, I hadn't relapsed on drugs or alcohol, I was as far from emotionally sober as I've ever been. And, you know, I was in an active eating disorder. I was in and out of romantic sexual love addiction stuff. I was definitely not present in my body. And most of my spirituality was highly intellectual. It wasn't consistent stuff that I was able to actually engage in because I was so disassociated. And even though I was working a lot of recovery programs, it was the level at which I was reenacting the energy of my family system in that doctoral program. There was no sense of safety, right? On Maslow's hierarchy of needs, my basic safety needs were not being met. And so, of course, I would be unaware of how this was so tied to my childhood. All I knew was that I couldn't breathe and I couldn't go back there. That was how I hit my bottom around this topic. Was I was completely unable to function. So
Yeah.
obviously, I hope that if you're listening, you don't have to get to that place, you know, in order to realize that maybe you're reenacting workplace dynamics. But I guess a thing to contemplate if you're listening, is this happening to me? Are there times at work where you feel like you're responding from a less than adult place? You know, are you regressing in the way you're handling conflict? Have you examined or unpacked your relationship to authority? You know, these are all things to think about. And so, Sarah, when you realized this and you had these couple of bottoms in these workplaces, what did it look like for you? What were some of the either small or even big picture things that you started to do to unpack how your childhood was impacting your relationship with work?
Yeah. So this is where I could ramble about this for a really long time, because my main focus in life is this 20-something year career that I've had as a musician and multimedia artist. And that's the thing I love the most. And that's the thing I've always tried to center. And so a lot of the work choices that I've made over my life have been, how does this fit in with this thing I'm trying to do with my life, this art I'm trying to make? And I've just tried so many different approaches. But I think a big thing that I had to come to terms with was that I was still living in fantasy about the reality of what it means to actually support my art, what it means to actually be an adult who's making art in the world, and letting go of some sort of ego thing about, oh, if I have a quote unquote real day job, or if I have a quote unquote full-time job, then I've somehow am not also this other person, that it's all or nothing. I'm either giving up this creative part of my life or these dreams that I have in order to sell out, or I can't do both. And so that was a big part of this. There was a lot of grieving that needed to be done about this fantasy I had, or some fear I had about not being, I don't know what, perceived, impression management, how I was being perceived, or caring so much about what other people think. And then talking about ACA work, learning about my inner children in those first couple of years, being in these crazy job situations where I was physically endangered sometimes. Like, what am I doing? I am putting myself in this extremely dangerous situation. So what? So I can not have a 9-to-5 job and still be considered cool to someone that I don't even know who is even paying attention to that. So there was just this whole shifting that needed to happen. And it was a growing up period where it's like, no, if I'm going to be a good mother to my art, which is my baby, I got to get a job. And I got to learn how to stop doing this hustling, side gig, working for narcissists, thing that I was doing to survive 3 jobs at a time, and get myself a job somewhere that's secure, safe, emotionally not distressing, allows me the mental energy to go home at the end of my workday and not be thinking about the job all the time, not being worrying that some scary boss is going to text me at 10 p.m. with a panic text, getting out of that workaholic dysfunctional relationship with these job places that were so toxic. So there was a very long stretch, probably a year, where I needed to work really hard in my therapy and recovery to just reorganize the way that I was thinking about all of this stuff.
Absolutely. And what I'm really hearing from you is that part of the beginning of the recovery was to even look at this identity, this professional identity, this part of yourself, because that was very true for me. In order to survive my childhood, I became a scientist. So my version of it was I had to control, I had to measure outcomes. I had to create something that would be shiny and impressive on the outside. And I had to do that more than take care of myself, more than anything else, because if I didn't become a scientist, I wasn't going to be okay. And your version of that obviously is an artist, a performer, a musician. And so everything in my life was built around feeding into that identity. So looking at that and really asking yourself, but wait a second, where did I even get this idea from in the first place? And this is where I always bring in the idea of the considering all dimensions in the Inner RAE curriculum. Intellectually, maybe I'm at a 10 out of 10, but how am I doing emotionally? How am I doing physically? How am I doing financially? That is a big one. You know, how am I doing spiritually? How am I doing relationally in my other relationships? And just because this one dimension of my life, I am working towards this thing, what is it costing me? And recovery gets you out of the black and white and out of this chronic whack-a-mole and into what would it be like to be a 5 rather than a 10 in that area, such that I'm not robbing myself in these other areas.
Yeah, I love that so much. It's exactly what it is. It's, yes, maybe this one area is going well, or I'm striving so hard in this one area, but yeah, at what cost? Am I still feeling just as insane as I did before I hit my rock bottom? Am I affecting my friendships? Is my money stressful? Is my nervous system just activated all of the time? And also that black and white thinking that you can't be many things at once, that there's some sort of capacity limit that we have as human beings or something. I can only be an artist. I can't also be a software developer. It's ridiculous. But it is this survival mentality. It's an ego thing, major ego thing, which is just childish. It's just our little egos. You know, they're running the show for such a long time. I had to get out of that and let go of that.
Well, and our egos are just trying to keep us safe. It's just a very dysfunctional way to do it.
Yep.
So, okay, we hit this bottom. We have this identity crisis. After that, we go and get, quote unquote, the boring or the safe or the functional, quote unquote, job, which I have to be honest, that is not really what happened for me. There was a lot in between, and I ultimately work for myself. However, I want to start talking about the next layer of recovery. So you go and you get the 9 to 5. You go and you get the job that has the paycheck, the health insurance. You start to feel some financial stability. So you get out of that extreme black and white. However, guess what? This stuff is still showing up. So talk to me about this next phase for you. Now that you were no longer in pure survival mode, what was this next phase of recovery for you around work?
Yeah, this was a growing up phase, a major growing up phase. I already had confronted a lot of the ways that I was sort of still acting like a teenager, dressing like a teenager, sort of presenting as a 22-year-old at age, 34 at this point. But I was still surrounded by adult children who were also, their inner teenagers were running their lives, even if they were my boss, So I get into this work environment that's corporate day job, suits, business casual, I was like, whoa, these people are grown-ups. And it was such a weird feeling because I'm a grown-up. I'm 34 years old in this job, but it was the first time I was around people who were acting like adults. Now, again, no one's perfect. So even in this environment where people are acting respectful, they're being grown-ups, they're showing up to work on time, there's an HR department, there's boundaries, there's a clear job description here. People aren't calling you on the weekends at home. there's still going to be personalities and stuff. But I just remember the big growing up was that first year of just being like, wow, they're treating me like an adult, and there's boundaries here, and there's a structure here. And it was just really cool. I remember feeling a lot of relief, honestly, because this is the first time I was in a working environment where I was like, oh, I'm okay. It's okay to make mistakes. I'm not going to get fired or blacklisted or made the bad guy if I make a mistake. I'm so grateful for that experience. And then within that, once I started feeling safe, okay, this is what it feels like to be in a safe, healthy family system. Now I get to start seeing where my control stuff comes up and where my little defects are coming out, and where my old survival patterns are kicking in, and I don't need them anymore. I don't need them anymore. They're not serving me here. And so then it was years of chipping away at those little nuanced things that I was doing, knee-jerk reactions, and continuously having to learn the lesson like, no, you're safe. It's okay. You can make a mistake. That you can learn. People here are not going to throw you out on the street if you make a single mistake. So it was just a lot. It was just being around, being in the structure of that, building my self-esteem. Oh, I'm a worthy part of this family system. I belong here. I have something to give. I'm useful. They want me here. And I can also learn and stay humble. And when these little defects kick in and my need to control, which is the biggest one, and my need to be right, which is so huge, kicks in and I act out on it, I can practice making amends. I can practice saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong. And in this safe environment. And now I'm not going to say that every corporate place is safe or every 9-to-5 job is safe.
No, we know that's not true. Well, and what I was going to say, this is where our journeys are different, right? Because I left my doctorate and I got my first, what I would consider to be a safe job. I mean, I worked in a treatment center, an addiction treatment center. So it's relative, but relative to where I had been, it was safe. And I remember the whole first couple months, whenever authority figure would give me a compliment, I would literally look over my shoulder because I didn't think they were talking to me. Like, it was so shocking to have kindness, to have leadership, to have feedback, to have boundaries. I remember my boss would come, he figured this out pretty early on that I would just stay and work. But it was one of those jobs where you legally could not, an appropriate job where you legally could not make someone work overtime without paying them overtime, which is not the environment I came from with my doctorate or what you came from in the music industry. And he would come and knock on my door and he'd be like, Erin, it's 5 p.m. It's time to go home. And I'd be like, but wait, I have a, he's like, no, I'm going to come and actually lift you out of your chair and send you home. And I just remember being like, oh my goodness, I didn't even know how dysfunctional my work environments had been, the same way that the first time I realized that people left Santa Claus cookies and milk, but in my family, we left Santa Claus whiskey. And until someone pointed that out to me, it didn't occur to me that that was like alcoholic and dysfunctional. So I feel like there's this new experience of, okay, I'm in the safe place. Okay, there are boundaries. And almost like I had moments of shame of not really knowing, like, how did I not know that you go home at 5 p.m.? How did I not realize they were complimenting me? And what I did, which is a little different, and we can talk about this difference, is I only lasted 8 months at that job. It was too boring for me, to be honest. I was bored. And because my childhood was excitement over safety, I still had to go out and get another hit of that. And I honestly did that for another probably 8 years before I'm really starting to enter this phase of prioritizing peace and calmness in my body and in my nervous system over excitement or money or accolades or whatever, right? And I hate to admit that because that's messy in my shadow and it's way less worse than it used to be. But I really have been operating out of this place of, oh, this is starting to feel safe. Now I'm bored. Let me go stir the pot. So anyway, speaking about you, because you really stayed at this job for a long time, talk to me about what that was like when the boredom would come up or when you would hit those plateaus. How did you cope with that and apply your tools to it?
Yeah. And this is where, I really, this is speaking directly to the people out there who are trying to support a career that isn't making them money with this day job. This is something that they're finally starting to talk about. New York Times published an article about this. Artists are finally coming out and saying, it's okay to have a job, guys. Because if I was just satisfying my creativity with my day job, that's a whole path. Or if trying to find the 9 to 5 that really feeds my passion and connects to something that I really feel passionate and care a lot about. For me, it was more like, what's the job that's going to pay these bills? That's going to, where I can stay sane. It's not going to affect my serenity or my sanity. I don't have to get too emotionally involved. It's not going to make me lose sleep at night, so that I can clock out. And then all of my creative energy is available to me from 5 p.m. until I go to bed every single night. So that was really where I feel still to this day, I found a hack as an artist. As soon as I stopped having the thing that was paying my bills cause so much distress and dysfunction and toxicity in my life, and it was just easy and simple, get it done. Like you said, work-life balance. I'd never heard that before. I got this job, work-life balance. I was like, what are you people talking about? As soon as I was in that, not only did it like, first of all, just bring so much calm and ease to my life, because my bills were paid. I had food in the fridge. I bought a house. Like what? These are things I did not think I would ever. Bought a car, things I never thought I could do. It freed me up energetically, psychically, mentally to be more creative and more productive than I had ever been. And this started to happen so quickly, like within months, that I was like, oh, I have found the hack that I had been looking for decades before. And so that was what was a no-brainer for me. Like, oh my gosh, this is working like nothing has worked before. I can support my art in a way that I've never been able to. I'm more productive. I'm more creative. I have more mental space. My body's not anxious all of the time. And it continued to be like that. I mean, I stayed in that job, different roles for 8 years before I left, only to go to school to keep building my skill set to get a better day job. So that was the driving force for me. And I think it's not just being an artist, like a painter or a dancer or a musician. I think that you can be any kind of thing that you're passionate about outside of work. And I think this can actually apply to anybody. Let the day job just be a job. It doesn't have to be this fulfilling, soul quenching thing. It can just be the thing that's allowing you to live your life the way you want to live your life, whatever that looks like to you. And I think a lot of people, sometimes when I hear them being like, oh, my job, I'm like, we got to reframe that, because that job is affording you mental time and energy and space and finances to do a lot of stuff with your life. That's what kept me going.
Yeah. Well, and I love that story because, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, I've recently been getting certified and trained in quantum human design. And one of the fundamental things for those listening, the difference between Sarah and I, huge difference, is that Sarah is a highly motorized generator, or alchemist is the term that is used in my current training. And I am a very low energy projector or orchestrator. So Sarah's approach to getting that 40-hour-a-week job that just pays the bills, I have to be honest, it will not work for my energy level. So, but I'm a smaller percent of the population. More people are more similar to you, Sarah, especially when you're not burned out. If you take care of yourself well enough, 70% of the population can probably do what you're saying. There is a percentage of the population that can't. So I'll speak to kind of how I managed this, because it is a little different, but yes, 100%. And before I go into how I dealt with it, I will say one book that beautifully talks about what you're discussing is the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. I don't know if you ever read it because you're so magical and creative. Anyway, I read it because I had creative blocks, and she talks about how even she, as a New York Times bestselling author, it took her years to not have a day job, because for her, it was never worth it to put the pressure on her creative work to support her, that was backwards. She needed to get the job to support her creative endeavors. And I will say, even when I go into how I work through this, that has been true for me. So what I found was really helpful as a human design projector, orchestrator, whatever, look this up. I'll probably do an episode on human design at some point. For me, because I had a finite amount of energy, I did have to get a job that was more closely aligned to my life's work and my life's purpose. So there was a synergy happening. Now, this is where if you want to reach out to me, I can help you get creative, because I knew for me, so I left my doctorate, I worked in the addiction industry, and I knew pretty quickly after that that I wanted to get into coaching, and specifically around relationships. So I spent many years building a relationship company with someone. That did not work out. It was another reenactment of my childhood dysfunction, unfortunately. So when I left that, I was in a financial crisis, to be honest, and emotional, spiritual, psychological crisis. So I went and got a really, really good, well-paid job. I was able to buy myself a house. I was able to recover financially. I was able to do all the things that Sarah's talking about. But when I picked that job, it was in alignment with a lot of my natural skill sets and talents, which is also true for you, Sarah, and the job that you picked. You know, I'd done all these personality tests. I'd read the book, The Big Leap. This was stuff that was in my zone of genius, right? It was stuff I was natural at. And it was closely related to my company that I wanted to rebuild and recreate and rebrand. So I was able to, once I got really good at that full-time job, I was able to, in my free time, have the energy to start putting together the building blocks, the sustainable building blocks that would allow this company to start to be its own entity and not need a ton of my time and energy. And the connections and network I was building through this full-time job would pay off for when I did want to leave my job. And I never hid it. I want to be clear. I did not hide it from my full-time employer. So there was no secretness here. I was very transparent, but because I was really good at what I was doing, they didn't care. In fact, they saw it as an asset. So there was transparency, there was openness. It wasn't this like secretive, dysfunctional thing, right? So I want to put that out there too. And ultimately, I burned out and had to leave. However, because I was using my tools and applying spirituality and all of those things to the process, I learned so much about myself. And that last year that I was in, the last job that I was in, when the triggers would come up that were related to the dysfunction from my childhood, I was able to see it, not react to it, and release it and have a corrective experience. So even though I maybe didn't take the same approach that you did, Sarah, by unpacking the way that my dysfunction shows up at work and my relationship to work, because we haven't even talked about my workaholism yet, which I think is not a mistake because it's still a work in progress. By unpacking that, I was able to have a somewhat functional relationship with this full-time job and leave, even though it was still scary and it was a leap of faith. And now I am depending on my company, my passion project, to support me financially, right? I'm doing that thing that we said not to do. However, there were years in the making to get me ready for this stage. And I also every day remind myself that I can go and get a job, that is an option. It would not be a failure as a relationship coach. It would not be reflective on my quality of service that I provide to my clients if I had to go get another job. Like, it would be okay. So with that all being said, any other thoughts that are coming up that you want to share with our audience around this topic?
Yeah, I think I love everything you said. And yeah, it is going to be different types of people depending on your approach and your energy level and what you're working on. Really, the way that you view the day job and that kind of thing will be different. But I think the thing I keep coming back to is just how much I grew up in the experience of working with other people and being in a professional setting like that I hadn't been in before. And yes, looking at the day job at just through a completely different lens than I ever had before. Also, just the boundaries of like people that I talked to frequently at work knew that I was an artist outside of work, but still to this day, probably 80%, 90% of the people didn't know, because they didn't need to know my personal details in order for me to do a good job and be a good teammate. I didn't need to be giving them gossiping about myself at work or getting all entangled in personal details. I was there to do a job. I did it well. We got along. We told jokes. It was great. It was beautiful, you know? And that I've taken that into so many areas of my life. Like, how important is it? Do I really need to share these personal things in order to accomplish this task. It's made me a better collaborator. It's made me a better at running the quote unquote business of my art. I do have a lot of people that I hire to help me, people I collaborate with creatively all the time, a lot of personality differences and types coming up against each other, and having the experience of being professional and having boundaries and letting their skills shine, letting them bring something to the table who they really are, and not trying to control that or change that or question it in any way. Just let everybody show up and do their best. And the best stuff comes out of that kind of collaboration. So I would also just say that having the experience of being in such a professional, grown up, left brain world has really helped me to be a better teammate, collaborator, leader, all these things that I want to be creatively too. And honestly, at the end of the day, they're not separate worlds. It's all the same. We're co-creating our reality all of the time. So it's a creative thing to learn about yourself in the workplace. It's an incredible laboratory to practice and learn.
Yeah, the act of being alive is a creative act, really. Yeah. So one thing you said that I want to point out that is so important, I'm glad you brought it up, is this idea of boundaries, because we touched on it, but you just really hammered it home. And within the anatomy of relationship curriculum, there's the intimacy spectrum. And I think so often people who grow up without boundaries or with a lot of dysfunction, for them, it's like on or off, connecting to people. And so one of the things to think about is when you are in a work environment, when you're in any environment where there are conflicts of interest, overlapping agendas, it's really, really important to examine what level of intimacy you're dropping into in your day-to-day connections with people and how much trust you actually have with people, because just because you spend a lot of time with people does not mean that they are emotionally safe to be holding your traumas or your emotions. And it's also not the right time and place. If you're being paid to do a job, should you be in that time processing your childhood trauma? Should you be in that time, personality analyzing your boss? Like, no, go to therapy, right? And so it doesn't mean you can't have personal relationships with people at work and develop that kind of relationship outside of work. But when you're at work, you are in the common ground intimacy, right? That is where you're at. And so learning what that means for you and how to show up at work, it will reduce drama, it will reduce chaos, it will increase your productivity. It will also mean that if something goes wrong at work, you're not as vulnerable, like they don't have all this personal information about you. Yeah, there's so many good things about understanding that intimacy it doesn't go from no contact to sacred, right? It goes no contact, acquaintance, common ground, which is a huge and broad area, to trustworthy, to sacred. And that in that common ground, it's such a beautiful, full type of intimacy that people like to skip over. And it's not boring. It can be really fun. Like you said, you can laugh with your friends at work, right? You can have fun, you can talk about things, but you don't have to drop into the heavy, deep stuff. Really, really, really glad you brought that up. So as we wrap up, even though I cannot believe this episode is almost over, as we wrap up, I want to ask you, I try to ask this of all of our guests, and we try to answer this in every episode. Sarah, who in the public eye is expressing their inner, radiant, authentic energy in a way that you admire or that helps you be in your most radiant, authentic self?
Okay, I have so many, but I think the one that jumps out to me most is Tabitha Brown. Do you know Tabitha Brown?
No, tell me more.
Tabitha Brown is a woman. She lives in Los Angeles. She went viral for eating this vegan sandwich from Whole Foods that she was driving Uber, and she was an aspiring actress, and she went vegan and was just sharing about that on social media. She ate this sandwich at Whole Foods, and it was this hilarious reaction video, and it went completely viral. And I found her shortly after that. And she just exudes this, she definitely has a deep connection to her higher power. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if she's done a lot of therapy and recovery, because the stuff she's talking about, I'm like, she's got it. And I've been following her for years, and her authentic self has not changed as she's become a multi-millionaire, super, super famous, extremely successful in many different categories, including her art entity. And she still is sharing these genuine, soulful, really honest, authentic messages about kindness, compassion, connection, her connection with her higher power, being a kind person. Just, it hasn't changed. And I just feel like that's really rare on social media, but she's hilarious. She's so just genuine. So she's definitely the person that comes to mind.
I'm going to have to look her up. Where can we find her? Do you know her
Yeah.
handle?
Tabitha Brown. I am Tabitha Brown. She's
Okay.
got, I mean, she's everywhere. She's got stuff in Target. She's got stuff in like all these
Ooh.
stores. She's got a video podcast. She's hilarious. She's on all the social media platforms. She makes great, delicious recipes.
Well, I will tag her in the show notes so people can look her up because she sounds fabulous. And you know what? I think you have sent me some stuff from her before.
Mhm.
So I am now understanding who you're talking about. I'm really excited to go back and look her up again. Well, today has been wonderful, Sarah. And I really hope we get to have you on here again. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our audience. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share with all of your friends, because we just want this message to get out to people, because everybody is capable of living within their radiant, authentic energy. And yes, that includes how you show up with your work and at work. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.